Good afternoon, everyone. We want to welcome you to the Got Money, Making the Case for Funding Food Policy Council webinar hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Future. My name is Ann Palmer, and I'm a program director at the center, and I work on the Food Policy Networks project. And in the room with me is Rachel Santo, who is going to be moderating the questions today. So today's conversation was inspired by many conversations we've had with food policy councils about the challenges they've had in trying to fund for their operations, program, and policy work. And I'm going to introduce our presenters, and then we're going to talk about how today's roundtable discussion will work. So we have 5 funders and food policy council leaders who have a variety of experiences in funding or receiving funding for local and regional food systems work. Allison Babb is the Senior Health Improvement Program Manager on the Community Initiatives team in the Center for Prevention at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota. She has over 20 years of public health experience, including 9 years working on healthy food access initiatives. She was the co-founder of the Minnesota Food Funders Network, where she was the co-chair for 6 years, and she served 2 terms on the Homegrown Minneapolis Food Council, and she was also a founding member of the Minnesota statewide Farm to School leadership team, which she served on for 3 years. Jill Ugland is the Vice President of Community Impact at United Way of Kern County and a founding member of the Kern County Food Policy Council, which serves as the backbone organization for the council. Jill has taken on much of the coordination responsibilities for the council as a result. She's a background in community development, both stateside and abroad, and her immersion in food systems work has resulted in her serving as one of its loudest local advocates. Lorene Leblanc is the Director of Health Equity and Community Engagement in the Florida Department of Health in Volusia County, Daytona Beach. She oversees school health, Healthiest Weight Florida, Florida Healthy Babies, health equity, community engagement, and the Community Health Improvement Plan implementation process. She was also the Director of Community Planning and Assessment at the Florida Department of Health in Volusia County and Duval County. And in Duval, she was the Director of Healthy Jacksonville, where she facilitated local dialogue and engagement around chronic illness and conditions such as childhood obesity, diabetes, and asthma through public-private partnerships. Christina James came to the John Merck Fund in 2008 after 20 years of working for small community-based human service and environmental nonprofit organizations in Maine and Massachusetts. She has a BA in Art History from Bowdoin College and an MA in Public Policy from Tufts Urban and Environmental Policy Program. Just prior to coming to the John Merck Fund, she was Executive Director of Earthworks, an urban greening organization based in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston. Her work in Maine included 4 years as Executive Director of an educational organic farm and 2 years working on clean energy and climate issues. Prior to becoming the Executive Director, she was John Merck Fund's Director of Programs from 2008 to 2017 when she oversaw the Foundation's environmental grant programs. And then finally, we have Ken Morris. Ken grew up and worked on an orchard in Waterford, Maine that produced, stored, packed, and shipped about 50,000 bushels of apples each year. He now lives in the next town over Norway, where he's been involved in community organizing, especially around food, for about 40 years. As part of his work, Ken helped launch the Farm to Institution New England and has worked on other regional initiatives like Food Solutions New England. He serves on the Maine Farm to School Network and the Maine Farm to Institution Work Group, and he now coordinates the Maine Network of Community Food Councils, a proliferating network of councils that work to rebuild Maine's community food systems. He helped create the Maine Food Atlas as an educational tool for helping communities envision and understand the diverse components of our local and regional food system. Before we get started on the discussion, we are using Zoom today, so we're just going to go over, spend a couple minutes just going over how Zoom works. So all of the attendees are in listen-only mode, and that's the mode you'll be in throughout the webinar. And so typically, there's a Q&A period that is mostly a discussion, so we'll be asking some questions, but then we'll also have an opportunity to hear from you. So at any time during the webinar, you are welcome to go ahead and type questions in the Q&A box or the chat box, and those are available on the bottom of the screen, and you can use either function. We'll be opening both of them. In lieu of the slideshows, each of the panelists speak to various questions in the form of a round-robin conversation. So we will begin by, we've already done the brief introduction by each of the panelists, and we'll ask them some more detailed questions related to their efforts. But as I said, you can always add anything in the Q&A box. And then it's, because we aren't using slides, it would be fine to go ahead into the gallery view. So if you scroll to the top of your screen on the right-hand side, it'll give you an option for gallery view, and then you'll get to see all the panelists as they're speaking. And we will be recording the call today, and we'll send out a link afterwards. And now, before I hand it over to the panelists, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to the center. So the Center for Livable Future is an interdisciplinary center located at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. We work on the intersection of diet, environment, food production, and public health. The Food Policy Networks project is one of our projects, and the goal of that project is to build the capacity of food system stakeholders to reform local, state, regional, and tribal food systems through effective public policy. We do that through training, sharing best practices, networking with other food policy groups and leaders, and developing and providing food policy resource materials. If you aren't familiar with the project, we encourage you to check out our website and sign up for the listserv. We also have a fabulous resource database of about close to 1,200 resources, I believe now. So now on to the interesting part. We're going to have each panelist give a brief introduction to their experience, either funding or receiving funding for food policy councils and food systems work.
So maybe we'll kick this off with Allison as a start, and then we'll kind of rotate Allison, Jill, Lorene, Ken, and then Christine. And like we had explained before, just 3 to 4 minutes explaining a little bit more detail about your experience funding food system work, and then we will dive into the more specific questions. So Allison, you want to kick it off? And maybe we should unmute you. There you go.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Babb. I work in the Center for Prevention at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota. We are the fortunate recipients of tobacco settlement dollars due to a historic lawsuit in the state of Minnesota, of which Blue Cross was a co-plaintiff with the state of Minnesota. The Center for Prevention administers those tobacco settlement dollars to work on improving the health of all Minnesotans, and we work to reduce the leading causes of preventable death and disease in our state, including reducing tobacco use, increasing healthy eating, and increasing physical activity. So my work in the center on healthy eating issues over roughly the last decade has really included using policy systems and environmental change approaches to predominantly increasing access to healthy foods. I was very much involved with the creation of the Minnesota Food Charter, which is now being worked on for implementation across the state by local and regional food councils, as well as our statewide network, the Minnesota Food Charter Network. So lots of involvement from that perspective, as well as in my personal time, involvement with the homegrown Minneapolis Food Council during the first 4 years that it was in existence. So that's just a little bit of an overview.
Great, thanks, Allison. Jill, you want to go next?
Okay.
All right, there you go.
Yeah, okay. The current Food Policy Council is a collective of 30 or so very diverse food system stakeholders working together in a country roughly the size of Belgium. United Way of Kern County launched the council about 6 or so years ago in partnership.
Jill, just a quick question. We're having a little bit of hard time hearing you. I don't know if you could speak closer to your microphone, if that would be okay. Thanks.
Okay, let me see. How's this? Is that better? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'll get up close and personal here. So we launched the council in partnership with the California Endowment and our local community action partnership, the CAP of Kern, and we currently serve as the backbone organization of the council. We didn't start out to be a food policy council. In fact, I don't even think we really knew what a food system was. In fact, when we first convened back in 2012, it was because Kern had just been cited as the hungriest region in America. And I think we were all just plainly mortified about that. And the folks sitting around the table were all in the emergency food relief business. So our initial thought at the time was to come up with a 10-year plan to end hunger. 10-year plans, being all the rage at the time. And it didn't take long for us to realize that we really were asking ourselves the wrong question. It wasn't how do we increase the capacity of the food bank, but the question we really needed to be asking ourselves was, why are there so many people standing in line in the first place? So we just completed our countywide food system assessment. It was a $100,000 process, which we thought we'd be able to kind of bang out in 12 to 18 months, but actually wound up taking 3 years. And here it is.
Sorry, unmuted. Thank you so much, Jill. Ken, you want to go next?
Hi, everybody. I'm Ken Morse. I live in Western Maine, and my work in the last decade or so grew out of public health work was through the Healthy Maine partnerships, which were tobacco settlement monies, also like what Allison talked about, community coalitions, and many of these worked on food and nutrition and food system work, farm to school, that sort of thing. I was the director of the local Healthy Maine partnership. There were 28 in Maine, and I basically got sick of arm wrestling with the state. so I stepped aside from that, and I had begun to do more and more farm to school, farm to institution work, and then gradually the Food Council movement got started. Maine has a pretty dynamic food movement. We have the largest organic farming and gardening association in the country, MOFGA. We have over 100 nonprofits working on food system work. And so it was pretty natural that community organizing would start up. And so about 7 years ago, some of us that had been doing some Food Council organizing got together and formed the Maine network of community food councils. And that has been proliferating across the state. We have 12 active councils now, serving probably well over 100 towns. Some of them are just the 1 or 2 towns, but many of them are regional, a county or part of a county. So I've been helping to coordinate that over the last 7 years, and I think maybe later we'll talk a little bit about some of the funding work that we've done.
Thank you, Ken. Lorene. You can go ahead, we just unmuted you. I'm not sure. Lorene, can you hear us? Or maybe you have to unmute yourself on your side too.
I'm sorry, I was on mute on my side as well.
Okay.
I'm Lorene Husband with the Florida Department of Health. I am located in Volusia County, which is, to those of you who do not know Florida, that's in Daytona Beach, but I live in Jacksonville. And my food system work started in Jacksonville as a local response to childhood obesity. The community had come together and formulated a local call to action to address childhood obesity. And one of the strategies for that call to action was to start a food policy council. And with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Florida Blue Foundation, we convened about 350 community partners and residents to later on, which, resulted in the beginning of the Duval Food Policy Council. But that's how I started my food policy work, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about funding later on, and public health and how it intersects together. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorene. And last but not least, Christine.
Hi, everybody. This is Christine James. I'm in Boston with the John Merck Fund. And the John Merck Fund is a small family foundation with 4 program areas, 3 of them focused on environment, and the Regional Food Systems Program is the one that I'll be talking about today. And as the name implies, we take a regional perspective to our food system funding on the basis that New England has a regional identity and that each of the New England states on its own is not necessarily self-sufficient in terms of both the food that it needs and the food it grows. So thinking of it more regionally makes more sense for the region and for the states individually. A couple of the groups that Ken mentioned in his introduction are organizations and networks that John Merck Fund has funded, the Farm to Institution New England, Food Solutions New England, with the idea that working as a region and networking across the different states will help move the region forward on all of its goals. John Merck Fund is a little different from the other folks who've talked about in terms of our motivation for engaging in food systems work. While we are certainly, we care about getting healthy food to everyone, we're also cognizant that you need healthy, viable farms for that food to be available to folks in the region. And so our focus has been about how do you support growing different markets for the farmers so that they can maintain healthy, viable farms, keep farmland in agriculture, and make sure that we have a food resilient region into the future. So much of our grant making has been around technical assistance for farmers and food producers so that they can run good, strong businesses, and figuring out the supply chains to institutional customers because they are big consumers of food and they're stable in terms of they're not going anywhere and they pay their bills, which are both important things to farmers. So we'll go into more detail later, but that's why JMF is in this work.
Great, thank you so much, Christine. And thank you to all the panelists. So now we're gonna kind of begin more of a conversation between the panelists. We have some questions that we've prepared and talked with, but I know several other people who are on the call might have other questions, so please feel free at any time to write into the box and we'll integrate those into the conversation. But I guess we can start with Allison. Do you have any insights, Allison, into how we might get the public health community to support more Food Policy Council work?
Yeah, so I don't know if you saw my note. I was wondering and maybe if we can do this while I'm talking, that would be great. I'm curious to know how many of the folks on the phone currently have the public health community at the table for their Food Policy Council. My impression is that it's pretty, yeah, you're raising your hand, Jill. I appreciate that. So I think it's become much more common. And, you know, Jill, in your introduction, you talked about childhood obesity and that trend driving the impetus for your work. I know in other spaces, concerns about diabetes are the primary motivation. And I think in general, and then an increasing understanding and widening understanding that hunger is a very serious public health issue. Thank you for the poll. I appreciate that. So if you do not already have the public health community involved in your Food Policy Council, I think learning what are the stated priorities of your local health department and what types of initiatives they may be involved in. So in Minnesota, for example, we have something called the statewide health improvement partnerships, which are partnerships in each of our local community health segments. It's too complicated to explain kind of how the geographies are arranged, but there are many of them across the state, and they're really working on the same leading causes of preventable death and disease that I talked about in my introduction. So tobacco and obesity, and really within that obesity umbrella, looking at both healthy eating and physical activity. This has spurred activity related to increasing access to farmers markets and EBT work, and as well as community gardening, farm to school approaches, many other kind of systems level approaches to increasing access to healthy foods. And as a result, the public health community in Minnesota has become much more engaged in food systems work. And in many cases, they're either a co-convener. Okay, so good. 92% of you are saying yes currently. Great. So maybe I'll just wrap it up and say, if you're not already doing that, I would say it's low-hanging fruit to invite someone from either your local public health department or your statewide health department, depending on what the geographic focus is for your specific council.
Allison, this might be a good chance to bring in Lorene, because she has mentioned and talked to us before about how the community benefit health plans in particular are a really untapped funding source for a lot of food policy councils. So Lorene, could you describe a little bit more about how your council went about getting funding from a community benefit health plan to support your work, and how that ties into some of what Allison has been talking about?
Yeah, so like what Allison was saying, and as well as what I alluded to. So when, you know, like if you're developing a food policy council, obviously you're going to have some priority goals. And one of the key things, like inviting public health, you also need to invite your local funders and your local hospitals and your local banks, all the people who have money who could potentially fund you. They have to be part of the process as well as you're setting your goals and priorities, because they will influence some of their priorities that you choose, because they know that they are going to be able to support them. And then I think whoever you are, whatever agency you're working from, and let's say you want your local hospital to fund you, you need to be familiar with their community benefit plan. Because if, let's say, like Allison was saying, if they want, one of their priorities is to reduce the incidence of diabetes in the community, there is no way they can do that without also working on prevention strategies such as access to healthy food, access to fresh food, having, you know, maybe community gardens, urban farms, local grocery stores. And that's where you come in, that maybe what your community needs right then is not necessarily to push a policy, but to start having strategies on the ground that can set the example for good policies. So if you're having a vulnerable neighborhood that doesn't have a grocery store and doesn't have a farmer's market, you could go to your community benefit partners and ask them to fund that strategy, and make sure that you align it to what their strategic plan is as well, which is their, you know, community benefit plan. And if you can do that, then your ask becomes really easy. And the other thing that I think, and probably everybody here knows, is you have to become an advocate, and you have to have really great, meaningful relationships with all your partners. Because if you do that, you will know before you even ask whether there's a chance that they will fund you or not. And if also they're co-creating the plan with you, since it's their plan, the money becomes really easy to ask for.
Great, thank you, Lorene. I think we'll jump now to Jill a little bit to talk about how United Way provides support for your food systems work. And how does working with food policy councils align with the work of United Way?
Okay. Well, first of all, United Way is an advocacy body. So can you hear me okay? Okay. And so therefore we have the capacity to take the lead in pushing through policy at a local and state level without the advocacy limitations that a lot of our partners face, like public health. And we also have the infrastructure, the 501c3, the Grand Stock Bev interface, in comparison, a comparatively nimble accounting process and our protocol, I guess you'd say, and strong connections with the local network of community funders. We've got grant writing capacity. We're like the perfect date. So we also have facilitation skills, which is, and the ability to bring together really diverse stakeholders and get them to a place of common ground, which is really can't be overemphasized, really, especially in these trying times. So, and for those of you who are not familiar with the Central Valley of California, we are a red county and a sea of blue. That's all I need to say. And so I guess other thing is, in terms of mission alignment, United Way's work here in Kern County focuses on family, financial stability, early childhood development, and hunger and homelessness. And we also are the collaborating entity body for the Kern County Homeless Collaborative as well. So we are playing that same role. So but we bring a poverty lens to the table and a fairly comprehensive analysis of the impact it plays on food access. So, which has been really, really important because many of the stakeholders are in the weeds, and so we have the capacity to push the weeds back and remind them who else is out there. So it's these connections to the issue that have justified the United Way covering my time. So.
I have a quick follow-up question, Jill. I'm just curious. I think I know of one or two other councils that are affiliated with United Way. Do you know if there's a larger push across the country to integrate more chapters of United Way with food policy groups, or how did that come about in your area?
I cannot figure this out. It just seems like, I don't know if it's just unique to Kern County, because we do have such a tremendous disparity of wealth, and our industry is the global food system. I mean, it could be like the Toyota plant, right? I mean, we're dependent on global ag for the salaries, not for the food access. And so, I think we do have a really, it could just be because of our unique situation. But yeah, I'm like shocked and appalled. My colleagues aren't doing, any of you are out there, calling you out.
And just so people know that, yes, it is being recorded, and we'll be sending out the link later. We had somebody ask about that question. And I understand that a couple people are having trouble hearing Lorene a little bit. So Lorene, if you're fading in a little bit in and out, but we'll keep going. And just if you're close to the phone, it'll probably work.
So before we will ask Allison and Christine for a few more questions about, as being grantors or funders of some of these efforts, we'll ask you a few more questions. But for another perspective, Ken, could you talk a little bit about your interesting shared funding model and how you're kind of a hybrid in that you receive funding, but you also give funding to food policy councils in the state?
Sure. First, I would just comment on the United Way's involvement. Our network is very much a peer-to-peer sharing networks of councils. We have one of our newer councils has come on, and the United Way there has been one of the leads in that. And what we tend to see is that, and that hadn't been the case anywhere else, but now they're talking about their evolution at our network meetings has encouraged other councils to reach out to their United Ways. So that is that sort of proliferation of different kinds of contacts. Sometimes it's the councils of government or the faith community or whatever. So that has proven to be one of the benefits of that, the peer-to-peer sharing. Our network has had primarily two major funders over the years. And the second one that came on board said they would primarily like to fund local councils. They would give the network money, but they'd like most of it to go out to the local councils. They had already been funding a few councils individually. And about that time, we learned about the shared gifting process that's been evolving and spreading across the country. And so we adapted that. And the way it works is we devote close to half our funding each year to local council allocations. And the process is we get a little committee to put together an RFP for proposals. councils submit proposals. We immediately send all the proposals out to all the councils who could get together in a meeting, and they present to each other what they want to do in their proposal. And then we have a process where they're guaranteed a certain part. Usually it's like 2/3 of the amount that we come up with, depending on how many proposals we have and how much money we have. And then they're allocated the rest, and we have sort of a voting process where they can allocate any portion of that amount to any of the other councils based on how excited they were about the proposals they heard. So it's been really a great process because all the local councils become funders. They're partially funders. It's really encouraged the peer-to-peer sharing. We then, throughout the year, the heart of our meeting is the community updates based on the updates about what they had proposed, and it really has accelerated innovation across the network, because if one council does something, tries something like the Lewiston Auburn Council a year or so ago did a community food charter. And now the other councils are starting to do that, or other people have done municipal reviews or gleaning work or whatever it is. The sharing the peer-to-peer sharing that goes on has really accelerated innovation across the network. And just the process of the shared gifting thing I've noticed is that now, much more so than before, the local councils feel like they are the network, that they own the network and they are the network. So that's been a real empowering network development tool as well. You're muted.
Sorry, thanks. Allison, I think you had mentioned that there's similar efforts that are underway, or at least under consideration in Minnesota around the shared gifting model, correct? Do you want to speak to that a little bit at all?
Well, I feel my colleagues at the University of Minnesota Extension are the ones leading that effort. I know they've been in regular contact with Ken. They did pilot it both internally in their, I believe it's called the Food Issue Area Network within Extension, and had a very positive experience. And, many of the things that Ken described in terms of, it being a really great learning experience, and also, and actually I feel like in some ways it builds capacity to understand what funders might be interested in, because as Ken mentioned, it puts people in the position of being funders, and that's a different hat to wear than what many of the advocates are used to being. And so I think they had a good experience with it. My understanding is in 2018, they will be doing some additional piloting internally, but with a different audience. It's mostly the food extension educators that are engaged more in the local and regional food networks across the state, with the ideal end, hopefully, of having it be much more like what Maine is doing in terms of doing a pilot that would then engage our local and regional food councils. So very excited about the idea of that, and eager to see what happens later in the year.
Great, thanks, Allison. And maybe this will jump into Christine. So speaking of how people becoming in the funder position, they start to understand what funders are looking for. What elements are you looking for when you receive a grant application? What factors are you trying to consider about who to invest in and how much?
Yeah, those are good questions. And most of my career, I was on the grant seeker side of the equation, and then I came over to the dark side or the light side, I'm not sure which one it is, as a grant maker. And I used to think, oh, give me the problem of giving money away. How hard can it be? It's hard because there's a lot of really great efforts going on all the time. And trying to figure out where should we put our resources is challenging. JMF, for the first 40 years of its existence, was a perpetual foundation, and we were funding agriculture efforts, but just in Vermont. And then in 2010, 2011, the board decided we're going to switch to a spend-out foundation and spend not just our interest on the endowment, but the whole thing over a 10-year period. And that's when we switched to a regional perspective, no longer just about Vermont, but all of New England, and focused our strategies on a lot of the policy work through food system planning in the 6 New England states, the regional work that Ken has talked about, Farm to Institution New England, Food Solutions New England, Healthcare Without Harm's work, working with hospitals in New England as purchasers of food and places where a lot of people get fed on a daily basis, and the Real Food Challenge, which works with colleges and universities with the same premise that they feed a lot of people every day. And so we're looking, when people propose to us, that they are connected somehow to either the food system planning going on in their own state, or this regional work, Food Solutions New England or FINE, or they're looking to help the farmers who are responding to the market signals now that there are hopefully more of these institutional buyers and wholesale buyers that are interested in buying food from regional producers. So there needs to be some connection to the strategy that we're pursuing, because with our grantee partners, we set objectives over a 10-year period to try to reach. We give about $1.5 million a year out to the New England food system efforts, and we hope that all of them, we've been supporting a lot of networking, a lot of connections among and between folks doing similar work in different states, so that, as Ken was talking, they're sharing best practices, they're learning from each other, because a big motivation is because they all know that we're going away as a source of funding. And so the more connected and coordinated they are and able to speak about their collective impact on the region, the more likely it is that they will have a good story to tell other funders, not only private foundations like us, but public sources of dollars and individual donors, folks who can see, oh, I understand the value of policy work or the value of networking that would actually help move the food system forward in New England.
Thanks, Christine. And that kind of raises a question for everyone: is what advice do you have about measuring the impact of policy and advocacy work? We've struggled with this ourselves here, trying to document what's going on across the country and the impact. But we're wondering, what have you seen that's worked, or if you're a food policy council, what are the things that you're using to document that?
And you're all unmuted, so you can.
I think one of the things that we look at is community engagement. We're really concerned with how the work that the council is doing is truly reflecting what the community aspires for its food system, and not just, the terrible problems we're facing in terms of health, right? So we're looking for these other kinds of measures. We want to see communities actually buying into this notion of a food system and looking at how and beginning to and understanding what their priorities are for working to strengthen it. So, everything from just like how we measure that is, involvement in community meetings, and how, what is our leadership pool? Is it growing? Are we growing it? Are we seeing new people at the meetings? Are they the same old faces? The professional meeting goers. So, so it's like we do have these indicators to help us try to measure this other less tangible thing, but we feel it's really important.
Thanks, Jill. Anyone else have ideas on how to measure your policy and advocacy work? the impact of that? If you're funders, how do you look for that in someone's application? Do they just have to have metrics, or do you make sure that they look like they're reliable metrics?
Yeah, so from the John Merck Fund's perspective, we started out thinking that because food is something you can actually quantify, and you can like count bushels of corn or bushels of apples or what have you, it seemed reasonable to expect that if people could say we're starting out with this much food grown in New England being purchased by institutions in our region, and over this period of time we're going to get X% higher. It turns out the food system is really opaque. It's not really clear to anybody how these different entities are purchasing food. Even sometimes within an institution itself, they're not 100% clear on how their money is flowing and who's receiving the money for the food that they're buying. So we realized pretty quickly how complicated it is and how hard it is to understand where you can intervene in the supply chain or in the system to make a difference. And so, like Jill was saying, for us, even though we still have quantitative metrics that we'd like to see people reach, we also understand how difficult that is. So the relationships and the fact that people are talking to each other and sharing best practices and trying different ways to determine what difference they're making in the system, and iterating and learning, okay, that we learned a little bit here, or it's a little bit better here, and now we're going to modify it and try again. And so long as that's happening, and you can start to see at least a greater amount of interest on the part of the institutional buyers, or more farmers saying, you know what, I actually do like having colleges or hospitals as kind of a baseline customer. They don't pay a lot, but they pay on time, and it's an additional source of revenue, so I'm going to add an acre of corn next year, something like that. So it's not, we're not going to have amazing bar graphs to show our board, but there is great communication and movement forward in terms of understanding the system better and where to intervene to have a greater impact.
Oh, I want to just add on to that, Christine. You know, one of the things that we've been asking, we started asking it informally, is, you know, we'd have a picture of the food system and we'd say, okay, where do you see yourself in this picture? You know, so that's, you know, and then people would say, oh, I see myself there. Well, it's such a great tool that we're getting this big version of it laminated, so we can actually, you know, do the little stickers and have people actually stick, you know, say, okay, come up and put where you are, and then we can take a picture of it, and we can see how that changes over time. You know, where, you know, how is there a significant shift in people's understanding of their place in this, or, you know, and so we're actually really excited. But, you know, next time we all get together, I'll be able to show you our laminated food system chart.
Great, thanks, Jill and Christine. Does anyone else have any comments, or we can ask another question?
I wanted to say, I think it depends a lot on what the purpose of the funding is in terms of how we've measured things. You know, some of the things that we've funded are, so for example, we recently funded our Metro Food Access Network to host a series of conversations, critical conversations about race in the food system. And so, you know, the metrics for that are, you know, like really basic things like how many people attended and what was their engagement like. And of course we did, you know, post-event evaluations, and it's mostly qualitative data, I would say. But for the farm to school work that we have been engaged in, you know, again, survey work has been really important. So seeing things like increases in the number of schools that are participating in farm to school, self-reported metrics about what percentage of their purchases are local. So it's not a very exciting answer, but I did want to throw that in.
That makes total sense. We also have a question from the audience that's related, and it's particularly for Jill. And it's, Jill, do you measure the coordination or networking paths of your stakeholders in the community?
Well, if I understand that that question, we don't do it formally, but I mean, you know, we are very cognizant of how often global ag comes to the table, whether they are or not, and if they're speaking civilly or not civilly. So we haven't really quantified it, but we're all acutely aware of the growth that is taking place in our stakeholders, in their ability to play well with others, that kind of thing. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that. Is that what you mean, Susan? Is that what Susan was getting at?
I guess we'll wait to see if Susan writes in. In the moment, we can add that we also have several resources we've compiled on social network analyses in our resource database online that you can look at and learn about how other food policy councils have been starting to try to map their networking coordination in their councils.
Yeah, and actually we're in the process of finalizing a survey. We're going to be doing a statewide social network analysis of the 71 local and regional and issue area-based food networks in our state just in the next couple of months. And I'll put in the comments, one of the things that we've been funding, and of course we're not evaluating it because it is kind of an evaluation contract, is to do some network health assessment tools. So some of those are still in development, but some of them are already up and running. So I'll go ahead and send that out. And if people have questions about those, I'd be happy to talk about them more.
Great, thanks so much, Allison. Another question that came to us from the panelists, they wanted us to ask, what types of innovative things are you doing or funding? And this is kind of ties into a broader question that food policy councils themselves aren't really new. They've been around since the 1980s, and so a lot of groups struggle with what's so new about food policy councils that would interest funders, and what has not changed that might turn funders away. So if you could speak to anything about the innovation that you're dealing with.
So three things come immediately to mind, but we've already hit on them. So I'll just be very brief. So Ken and the work that they're doing around shared gifting, I feel like is very innovative. I think social network analysis is certainly not new, but there's certainly new ways to use that. And new tools available for doing that, whether you do a computerized one or you do hand-drawn maps. And I think also using more of a network approach as opposed to a more traditional coalition model. Again, not super new, but I'm seeing that surface more and more in our state.
Yeah, and I would reinforce that, I guess. we are network junkies to a large extent. We see our local councils as networks, and then we have networks of networks, and now there's a dynamic conversation going on in Maine about networks of networks of networks, I guess you could say. And you know, networks are viral, and if they're healthy and robust, they replicate themselves and create new nodes on the periphery or within themselves. We find that most of the I'm a sort of communitarian and somewhat resistant to wasting resources on state work, but having said that, have been extremely involved in Maine's food planning effort that Christine and other regional funders have supported, the Maine Food Strategy it's called. And we've been working really closely with them over the last year. But we find that that a lot of innovation comes at the community level. When people dig into the dirt with their hands and are working together, they have ideas about how to do things. if you have a networking system that shares those local innovations, they can spread like wildfire. And then the other thing is that what we're learning about is not only how to make those local networks more and more robust. We all eat, you know, so we all need to be involved in building a food system that endures and is adaptive. But we find that at the level of knitting together communities, we can learn a lot from that community work, and to some degree vice versa. So that the dialectic, I guess you could say, between the networking at larger geographic levels and the local level is a very robust kind of dynamic, and the learning just zips back and forth between the various nodes, and I think this whole so just to give you an example, like one of the major players in the food movement in Maine is Maine Farmland Trust. It has 30-40 people working for it. It's doing a lot of great stuff. So our network, the food councils, is talking with them about how can we support each other more. And the way we're talking about it is not creating some statewide strategic plan, but how can Maine Farmland Trust encourage their forever farms and their folks at the local level to be involved in the food councils, and how can the food councils support the land preservation work of the land trusts around. And we're starting those conversations with the Cheese Guild and the brewers and all sorts of folks. One of the innovations that's related to funding, I think, is locally here in Norway, we've started doing what we call the Foothills Food Festival. And we've done it 2 years, and it was like 700 or 800 people the first year, and it doubled. We now think we can fund our food council work through sponsorships of that festival, because we've had really good luck doing it. And that's what MOFGA, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners, does. They put on Common Ground, which is an amazing 3-day fair that draws 75,000 people. And they provide most of their funding, or a good portion of their funding, for their statewide work through that fair. So that's an example of we're replicating that at the community level. And other councils are starting to look, how can events and sponsorship by local food businesses of those events help sustain the food council movement.
So I have a couple of different things to add on to what Ken is saying, and maybe from a different, he's talking more from the community level up, and this might sound a little more from the top down, but it's grown out of the relationships that have been built over the last 7 or 8 years across New England through Food Solutions New England, Farm to Institution New England, where now, I don't want to get too technical, but there's a National Association of State Directors of Agriculture, NASDA. It's all the state ag commissioners. It's essentially their trade association or their affinity group. And they meet on an annual basis somewhere in the United States every year, based on whichever commissioner is the chief for the year. And there are regional associations under the NASDA umbrella. And so for the past 5 years, funders from across the country have made sure that the folks who are doing the work on the ground in whatever state NASDA is going to take place have a seat at the table with those commissioners at the same level as the top sponsors. So the Monsantos and Archer Daniel Midlands and John Deere's of the world, they're at the same level as those folks. So these are the folks who are doing the work on the ground, have ideas about what's working or what could be working, what policies are interfering with their forward motion, what policies are helping them. And we're making sure that they're able to go into this venue that they didn't have access to before, because we can put the money up, frankly, so that they can be there. But it's because of the relationships and the understanding of, in Ken's example, how Maine Farmland Trust and the food policy councils in Maine can work together towards shared objectives. They can bring that to this national platform, and those commissioners of agriculture have a lot of influence over the Farm Bill every 5 years, over how monies that come into the states from the USDA and the FDA and other federal agencies get distributed out into the states and localities. So it's something that has grown up over the years as we've understood how the policies and the different players at different levels do or don't interact, and how they could in a more strategic way to advance the work that everybody's trying to do at the ground level. And one other thing that has been interesting to us, watching people build relationships and get down to the core values, what is it that we're trying to promote, that in Food Solutions New England and a lot of the work in the different organizations, racial justice has become center of all of that work, which is not something I think many of us would have anticipated when we first started thinking about, we should do something about promoting sustainable agriculture in New England. But it's come through the relationships and the understanding of who does and doesn't have access to healthy food, or to the ability to produce food, or access to farmable land. And folks have put that front and center and educated the funders, quite frankly, about that has to be front and center if we're going to get where we're all saying we want to get to. So that's showing up a lot in the innovative kind of work that the different groups are doing.
Yeah, actually, to just jump on that, I mean, one of the questions that we were asked as we prepared for this is, some of the criteria that we look for in what we decide to fund. And I would say one of the main criteria that we're looking at these days is, will it advance health equity? And within that, will it advance racial equity? Just understanding how incredibly important that is to food systems work, given the legacy of colonialism and slavery in our country. And, that's still very, very real, and it shows up in all of our systems. But I think somehow it shows up more in the food system than in other places even, I think. Other things that we're looking for are, does it give voice to communities that have been historically marginalized? Are people of color and Indigenous people and other communities disproportionately impacted by health concerns? Are they involved in meaningful ways? So in leadership roles, really not just tokenizing people, but really giving people an opportunity to lift up the skills that they have, and access to voice to reach decision makers in ways that they may not have historically had access. I think also we look for things that build capacity. So ideally, when the work is done, the change that's created is a sustainable change. So some kind of policy or systems or environmental change that will continue on after the life of the funding. And then, of course, in our state, because we've invested so heavily in the Minnesota Food Charter, we do like to see that the work is aligned with food charter strategies. That's rather easy to do because there's 99 strategies across 5 domains. So not too hard, but trying to get people to be explicit in how does this advance implementation of one or more of those strategies. So those are some of the things that we look for.
Thanks so much, Allison. And when you were speaking, it kind of reminded me, and Lorene, I don't know if you wanted to bring this up in your discussions about the innovative things you've been working on, but in terms of giving voice to people who traditionally haven't had a voice and being able to access decision makers, you've done a lot of really innovative work in that area. So I don't know if you want to speak about any of that at all.
How much time do we have?
We have about 20 minutes left or so, and we'll have a few more questions, but you could speak for a minute or two if you have time.
In terms of food policy work, I think some of the work most of the work that we have done, like for example, there's a school we work with in Jacksonville that is one of the pillars for really taking food to the next level. It's North Florida School of Special Education. And we initially funded them, because during the time when we were working with this, we had the opportunity to also become funders and award grants to our community partners to help with our call to action. So based on our call to action, one of our strategies was to invest in school gardens. And we initially funded this school at $10,000. And they've taken that $10,000 and leveraged it into not just a school garden, but an urban farm that has turned into, they have then invested in buying food trucks that served fresh food. They go door to door selling fresh food in one of our food deserts. So these students who are special education students who would otherwise probably not get meaningful employment, that means a lot to them as well as their families and those they serve. They're now generating a lot of revenue around food production and food access points. And on Wednesdays, they've become the hub for creating food for the different churches that meet on Wednesday nights. And so they have taken this food concept and multiplied it into so many different ways and provided ways to sustain themselves as a school as well as sustain the community by giving it good food. And that's just one of the stories, especially when you think of that these are special needs students that otherwise folks would not really think about when they think about innovation and good food. So that's just one of the stories. And their voice is really present at the table to influence the next thing that happens in the food movement in our region.
Thanks, Lorene. Something that I don't think we talk about as much, but I'm really glad you brought that up. Thanks. Another question that we had, and this has come up less in today's conversation than in our preparation call with the funders and food policy councils, but many of you have brought up the regional or state-specific social and political culture and history that either help generate funds or funding priorities for your local and regional food systems work. And we were wondering if any of you might want to speak to the importance of understanding the context of where you're based when you're doing place-based food systems work, and how you use that context to pitch your funding proposals in different ways.
We have been able to tap into the capacity building priorities of funders because the Food Policy Council, it's an active learning community, not just around food system issues, but also in the things that help us be more effective in what we do. And we have seen, and measurably, we've seen that the capacity of the organizations currently engaged with the Food Policy Council, the stakeholders, really are, it is increasing, and those capacities have to do with, one of the biggest capacities is moving organizations beyond emergency relief. And if you're in an emergency relief organization, it's like, okay, you need capacity, becoming more cognizant of where you can direct the folks you're serving so that they can continue in their process towards financial stability. Don't just stop at the emergency relief. I know you only have so much bandwidth, but this is really important that you see beyond the emergency food relief component of what you're doing. And so, so this has been, we've tapped into Kaiser for, this kind of work, Kaiser Foundation, and Edison has given us money for capacity building for this kind of thing. But, it's like this need to have people see where they are in the continuum and know that they have a responsibility to getting people further down the continuum than, beyond just where their touch point with the family is.
So this doesn't speak to your question, Rachel, but I just want to jump on something that Jill said. One of the more exciting things that we've seen come out of the Metro Food Access Network, which is one of our I don't know if you would, it's a network that works on food systems issues. I don't know if it would fit your definition of a food council. Is an initiative called Super Shelf that's really looking at advancing the capacity of food shelves to not only make healthier options more available, but to use behavioral economics in terms of placement and in signage and other materials within the food shelf, where foods are in terms of the sequence as people go through a shopping model, to really influence consumer behavior. So, food shelf users to select healthier options. And that came out of the network work of MFAN, and now has NIH funding to help evaluate it, through the University of Minnesota. So that's the kind of thing that, Ken and others, as we've talked about, accelerating learning, and then, letting people take off and really run with ideas, and seeing where they go. And, not everything's going to be wildly successful. I mean, we learn a lot from our failures as well, but that's an example of, an idea from people who hadn't previously been in relationship with each other coming together in a very intentional way that I think is powerful and speaks to the importance of these networks.
So to the question of the knowing your context and how that influences how to engage or how to fund, I can say now, after 7 years of funding in each of the 6 New England states to do their version, whatever, and it's all been different, each state is different, their version of food system planning, it's really clear that those states where the state government itself is also engaged as a funder and a supporter of the food system planning, and they're partnering with the philanthropic sector to develop and then implement the plan, those states, things are moving faster than those states where the state government has not yet understood the value of the work that's happening. And it's pretty stark. And so in some ways, it's useful information. It's hard for those states where the state government has not been as supportive. But state governments come and state governments go. And there's a couple in the region that are going to go soon, and that's a good thing. And in the meantime, it's not like planning and implementation and networking hasn't happened in those states. It's just happened a little more, it's been harder for those groups to raise the money and to get the support and the notice that where the states where they have the state government involved. It's been easier, not easy, but easier. And so for the folks around the country where you're thinking about your own context, understanding that you have a little bit of an experiment that's gone on in New England, where you can really clearly point out in these states that you've gotten this far because the state and the private funder sector have been partnering on moving things. Other states, they've struggled. And that's something you can bring to your state representatives, your folks that you can have relationships with, and say, if you put in $1 and the private sector puts in $1, you'll get that much farther. So that's been really interesting, and wasn't necessarily something we understood was going to go that way when we got going. And for us to try to make sure that it's not just those states that have that kind of support from the private and public sector who are advancing and leaving everybody else to struggle. We are supporting these communities of practice so that the folks who are the food system planners and the policy folks in each of the New England states, regardless of whether their state's involved or not, they can network with each other and share best practices and help advance everybody, so that it's not this two-tiered, system where some states are really going great guns and others are struggling.
I think I would also like to say that in California, we have two very different interpretations of access and two different strategic directions when it comes to access, food access. And what we realized in the Central Valley is that that for us, the food access question is a much more fundamental thing. It has to do with just how you actually get food to communities. It's not the fact, it's not organic food, it's just getting fresh food to communities, especially in the rural communities where there just is an absence of access points. And because of this, we realized that most of the legislative conversation in California was very much, because of the proximity of the players, it was very much dominated by NorCal, by the urbans, Northern California, San Francisco, and also the Los Angeles base. And so when they're talking about access, they're talking about something pretty different. I won't say completely different, but they're talking about it at a level that we aspire to. But I mean, we would love to get organic artichokes, but right now, actually, we'd be really happy just getting, kind of run-of-the-mill tomatoes out into some of our communities. And it's been a real eye-opener for our Food Policy Council to participate in those conversations at the state level, because it's just so easy to get just locked in your own routine of doing stuff, and then one day you go into a room full of people who are talking about these things, but within a completely different context, and it's just like, well, like I think a great example also is like the sugar sweetened soda beverage tax. It's just a no-brainer when you're talking about this in California in the policy, in terms of policy at the state level. And until you remind people that, well, okay, yes, sugar sweetened beverage sodas are, hazardous to people's health, but so is not having potable water. And when a gallon of the orange water is cheaper than a gallon of the pure water in communities that have been devastated by the drought or devastated by pollution in the wells, it's an aggressive tax, to talk about taxing those kinds of beverages. And it's like, you can't, it has to be linked to clean water. You have to link that conversation to clean water. And I think, before we started being noisy about it, I think that people were just saying, well, okay, this initiative needs to be linked to studying obesity of LMI families. But it's like, why you're asking poor people to pay for the privilege of having themselves studied? It's like, it just didn't make sense. But it's a very different way of looking at this issue that's mightily popular in the urban areas.
Thank you, Jill, for reminding us of things that we don't think about here on the East Coast, and we don't have droughts or contaminated water sources that much.
Yeah. Certainly not to that degree.
Yeah. We did have a question from someone in the audience who is starting a planning process and was wondering how they might find funding for planning and community food assessments or community assessments in general, and we didn't know if any of you have experience with this that you wanted to chime in.
I do. Let me just hold it up again. So this puppy cost about $100,000 to do, and it took about 3 years. We got this one in just 6 months. And we got the major health networks in our area to participate in funding, so like Kern Health Systems, Kaiser Permanente. These were the ones who really stepped forward, and because they saw that that there was a direct tie between their ability to affect outcomes and and knowing what the real base is that from which we're starting. So we did that. And we also got a really large contribution from the wonderful company, one of the major global ag players in our county. And so, but again, it was in looking at this, it was pitching it as, we have to get beyond emergency food relief. It's killing us to just look at food insecurity in terms of emergency food relief. Nothing is happening. We're just ending up with more and more hungry people. So we have to get beyond that. And so that was a really compelling. And the other thing we said was that we'll take your money, but only if you're at the table. We do not want to have this conversation in some kind of intellectual vacuum. We want to have this conversation with you. So yes, we would love to have your money, but if you're not willing to be at the table with us and talk about this and go through the process of this assessment, then, it's not going to really do anyone much good.
So I'm going to say something that might be kind of heretical to say. I've been on the funding end of funding major plans like the one that Jill's organization has led. And I've also been involved in kind of, butcher paper and a group of 20 advocates that are really motivated, mapping out what resources exist and where the energy is. And I do think if you can get $100,000 to do a plan that will be really comprehensive, that level of detail and thoroughness may be compelling to some of the policymakers that are your targets. But I also think that if you can't get $100,000, don't underestimate what a committed group of advocates can put together. Many of you already know the solutions, and my advice to you would be to not study it to death. And if you can get a small amount of resources to do something that's less thorough, if you have good community engagement, which does require some resources, whether they're cash or people power, don't underestimate how influential that might be able to be.
We just knew, though, that in terms of especially environmental concerns, that there was no common narrative around why things were the way they were. And in fact, we had, social justice agencies when we first started, the social justice groups and the global ag were, I really was fearful at times that they just throw themselves across the table at each other. So, except one time. But we just, it's really important to figure out what the actual underlying issue is in your community. In our community, the underlying issue is people did not want to come together. They didn't want to talk. They've already written off the other's perspective. So, global ag written off. Social justice groups, we're just naive, we don't understand. And so there was just no way to move. There was no way to unleash funds or anything because people just were so not on the same page. And so I think in a situation like Kern's, where you have such a diversity of viewpoints, and that, it was actually, I'm glad that we actually decided to go ahead and do this. And because looking back on it now, I don't know how we would have been able to get to the place where we are now. And we have working groups, and the working groups are made up of these diverse stakeholders, and they meet all the time, and they're calling each other by their first names. They have beers together. It's just it's a whole new world.
That's great. I want to respond to a comment from Susan to all of us. She talks about how they were able to find funding through their planning commissions. So working with land use planning professionals, and also educating advocates and public health professionals and food justice practitioners on the comprehensive land use planning process has been something that we've been very intentional about in Minnesota. And we actually have a guide that's educates both planners and advocates on the planning process that I'll just send them to, because I think it is really helpful. Unlike Susan, our planning commissions have not been funders in this space, but I think through our 2040 comprehensive land use planning process that is, that is going on right now, and plans have been submitted, and now we're evaluating what the impact was of our efforts in trying to get health equity language and healthy food access language into those plans. I think hopefully we have increased buy-in among planners, and they may potentially be sources of funding, or at least advocating for whatever geographic entity that they do planning for to be engaged in more food systems work.
And I would just say that I think what Jill and others have been saying illustrates is that it's really, to go back to your earlier question, it's very context specific. And so we would need to know where the person posing the question is, and what his or her context is, to understand who might be there, who'd be interested in funding it. There's also, you guys have resources. The Center for Livable Future, the Wallace Center at Winrock International has lots of resources. So food system planning and at the municipal, county, state, and regional level is a much more advanced and sophisticated set of work now than it was 7 or 8 years ago. And so you can't skip over the community process, and because your context is specific to where you are. And yet there are templates, there are, first you do this and then you do that can help you not have to spend $100,000, except in Jill's case, it sounds like that was kind of cheap, given where they were starting from. I mean, it sounds like you should go help out in the Middle East. Like you've got some peacemaking skills now. That's great. So it's so specific. Unfortunately, we can't just say, oh yeah, here's the bank that you can go to and withdraw the funds to get your planning grant. I wish, but there are these resources like the Center for Livable Future and Winrock and others that can help anyway.
I should say I sweated over that 100,000. We took sort of a leap of faith and decided we just couldn't wait to get this thing launched. And so even though we only knew for sure we had a portion of it, we went ahead and did it, and just trusted that once we got started and got the conversation going, that people would get it and would step up, and they did. But it was a lot of agita.
Well, unless we have any final questions, thank you all so much for providing your thoughts and expertise in from these different perspectives. It's been really nice. Maybe if we could go around and have one final last advice that you didn't get to talk about how food policy councils might, tell their story to funders or achieve any more success. If you have anything that you just are still hoping to get out, we have like 5 minutes left before I think we're going to get. I'm not sure exactly what happens when we run out of time because we've never went over before. But yeah, we could just start out with maybe Ken, and we'll go backwards through the at least I don't know if we all have the same screen, so we'll announce people as we go.
Yeah. I would say educate everybody on the power of networks, especially funders. That's one thing we're trying to do is talk with funders about the power of networks. We operate our network on very lean budget. We distribute about 20 grand to the local councils, and we have about 25% FTE for staffing the network. So it's the people power that makes it work more than the money. And I think the sharing heart of networks is what makes sharing of resources, of skills, of information, of innovation work. So educate everybody on the power of networks.
Thanks, Ken. How about Lorene? All right, you're on unmute now, Lorene.
Oh, no wonder I was talking and nobody heard me. I would say to the question about doing the assessment, I would remind people, don't forget to engage your public health partners, because we are, as public health, we're required to do the community health improvement planning process. And in order to do a good health improvement plan, you have to dig deep into what's causing all these issues. And definitely your food system assessment is critical. And so they might have the resources in terms of giving you some staffing time, also leveraging all the partners that need to come to this meeting. And as Ken said, this is really truly about engaging a lot of different people. And if you have like your environmental health professionals, your land trust folks, your hospital folks, community members, you really can start to put together a really good food system assessment that will drive the strategies that you would like to see addressed, because it's community engaged and driven. That's all I have to say. So don't focus too much on the money, but how do you do it based on what you currently have in your community?
Thanks, Lorene. That was very useful advice. Allison, do you want to go next?
Yes, took myself off mute there. I think we worked with Mark Winnie back in the day when the Community Food Security Coalition was still in existence. And he gave us some advice that I haven't forgotten, that I think is still useful today and very relevant to this conversation, which is pick something to do, pick the low-hanging fruit, and have an early win. And I think that that a success shared by a group of individuals working together just creates additional momentum and energy. It will also give you a track record to show funders.
Thanks, Allison. Christine?
Yeah, that's a very good one that I think that Allison just gave you, as is everybody's. And the other thing I think I know that works in engaging funders, and especially if you can get board members of foundations, is to actually get them out in the world and meeting farmers and meeting the people who are doing the organizing work, and not just writing about it in a summary for them or telling them about it, but getting them out and engaging and helping them realize that they're part of their food system too, and that this relationship building and the network connectivity is the thing that's going to move everybody forward. So they should invest in it and stick with it, because it will return multiple benefits to everybody.
Thanks, Christine. And Jill?
I think that it's really, what's the word, kind of seducing to have a group of people come together and build an initiative that's based on like the data, like in terms of like just like the basic raw data, like how many people are hungry, or how many people are obese, or how many people have diabetes. And so then you create an initiative that's apt to specifically address these statistics. In terms of accountability, though, it's really important to figure out exactly how those statistics translate into specific communities. And then that's your initiative. That should be the initiative. So it may be something that does not look like a direct link to the health outcomes that you're going to be held accountable to produce. But the fact is, you'll never get there unless you figure out how that that issue is translating itself in these local communities, and then that's where you start.
Great, thanks, Jill, and thank you all for spending time with us on a Friday afternoon, or in some cases, I guess, on the West Coast, a Friday morning, to talk about this constantly challenging issue for most groups in the U.S. and also around the world. I've talked to food policy councils and similar types of groups in Europe, and they face the very same struggles. So it's great to hear some advice from people who are a little bit more experienced. And we will be sending out a link to this recording on YouTube once it's ready. We'll also include all the links that the panelists have been sending out through the chat box. And if panelists, if you have any more that you'd like to share with people as a result of this conversation, please let us know, and we can try to wait off until Jill's graphic is done, and we can also send the link to that too. So with that, thank you everyone, and we'll stay in touch. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.